Hello, this is Dr. Winkler again. This is for the Ancient Civilizations class, and believe this is the third lecture I'm recording, and I can see if I can put this up on YouTube. You would have heard this lecture be the first lecture on the week of March 30th, going to, what would they be, April 3rd. So this is a lecture we're following up from the last lecture. And remember, last time we were talking about how Rome became Christian, at least in a formal sense. And I was telling you about Julian the Apostate. You can see him up here. And I told you that in a, shall we say, relatively small incident, in other words, getting killed in a skirmish meant that Julian would, of course, die, and we would not be able to establish a line of pagan rulers. Therefore, the other emperors coming after Julian were all Christian. Perhaps the next step in the Christianizing of Rome was a step made by the Emperor Theodosius. He made Christianity the state religion in 380 AD. This is something different than what we've seen before. Before we have patronage. Before we have money going to the church. We have toleration going to the church. Can we say the government is pushing, therefore, the idea of making the empire Christian? However, it's Theodosius that says that Christianity now is the state religion. This is the only religion you can legally follow. At that point, therefore, the resource of the state, including the military, has the ability now to force a religious belief system on the people in Rome. It'd be a little bit like if the government came out one day and said, okay, everybody in the United States has to be this religion, or everybody in the United States now has to be a member of this political party. Does this mean you've actually had a change? You see, in ancient Rome, if you want to be a general in the army, you want to serve in the civil service, you have to be Christian, or at least you have to say you're Christian. This happened in the United States, and one morning we all had to be Christian, let's say, or we all had to be Republican or Democrat or something like that. Would that actually change us in a fundamental sense? Well, it can make a difference in how we perform outwardly, and maybe how we perform outwardly does have an impact on us inwardly. But I have an example. Many years ago, I met a man who was a lawyer, and he had come to Washington, D.C., and there had been a change in administration. I mean, this is so long ago, I think maybe it's even talking about the Wilson administration. And as you probably know, the Republicans had controlled the White House for many years until Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912, and he was actually a Democrat. This man went in, he appealed for the job, he should say he applied for the job, and he got an interview. And the man said, I bet you've been a Democrat your entire life. Your entire family were Democrats. And the guy says, well, that's not the point here, is it? And the guy says, yes, it is. So everybody, even though maybe you've been Republican your entire life, now all of a sudden you're a Democrat because you want a job. Does that really change your political outlook? Probably not. Now, some people have argued very strongly that Christianity is a moral failure because Christian nations, in reality, are not necessarily acting in a moral manner. Now, you can certainly make that case. On the other hand, how Christian is really a nation where everybody has to be Christian? A response to that might be, well, we don't know about Christianity because it's never been tried. Can we say, therefore, the emperors and many other policies are done in the name of Christianity, even though there's not an awful lot of, shall we say, severe, complete conversion to many of the Christian ideals? We'll come back to this later, but we also find that as Christianity becomes more popular and more widespread in the Roman Empire, we find fundamentalist groups. In this case, I'm talking about monasticism. People don't want to retreat from society because they think they can find more purity by having done that. Let's go back to the idea that the state now is actively promoting Christianity. Theodosius has the army, as I've already mentioned. He has the police force, and they can do an awful lot to foment or push the Christian agenda. What we see happening is, under state sanction, pagans, my definition of pagan is fairly broad, it's essentially non-Christians, but pagans and non-Orthodox Christians are persecuted and destroyed. We have incidents about this time frame when we do get a Christian mob together, something like the prominent leader, a saint, a bishop, something like that, will actually come forward and say, oh, by the way, let's get together, let's go down to that pagan temple. And they get their pitchforks and they get their torches and they go down to the pagan temple. And bad things happen. They push people around, they push people outdoors, they start fires, they burn pagan records, and a lot of times the pagans were involved in tree worship. And when they're involved in tree worship, sometimes there was a very large tree near their temples. So the trees were cut down and used as firewood. To a certain extent, this was quite thorough. What we know about pagan religions largely comes from what the Christians wanted to record about them. The sources on paganism, written by pagans themselves, really have not survived. Christians are interested in what a prominent person said about the pagans, and sometimes we can say maybe what the Christians were saying about the pagans is tainted or a little unfair, but most of what we know about the pagans is what Christians decided to say about them, and usually it's in the framework of putting them down. But the pagans are hunted virtually out of existence, which means it's highly affecting what the Christians were doing. There's something else that we call non-Orthodox Christians. In other words, these are Christian groups that don't follow the main line. The main line can be defined by theologians and by the state. If you believe somewhat differently, you can be persecuted out of existence as well. We don't find numerous kinds of Christianity surviving from Rome. We do find essentially Orthodox or the same kind of Christianity coming out because it is something that's forced upon the people. Let's make a comparison between what the pagans did, particularly under Diocletian, in persecuting the Christians almost, can we say, made them retreat, never to non-existence, but quite frankly, their power was severely limited during his persecutions. And let's make the comparison with Christians or people in the name of Christianity persecuting the pagans virtually to non-existence. Can we say perhaps the persecution of pagans by Christians was more severe? It was certainly more long-lived, and ultimately is more successful. We'll come back and talk more about the Christians and how Christianity keeps Roman ideas alive and how it's transferred over to the Middle Ages and later to us. In the meantime, we need to talk about some other important things. In this case, let's start discussing the fall of Rome. The fall of Rome is an issue that's been discussed by historians for many, many years. Quite frankly, for centuries. The issues in the fall of Rome have actually attracted a great deal of attention. A question I'd like to ask is, what's the big deal? Why are we so interested in the fall of Rome? Why are we so interested in why it fell? I have it up here. It's a big deal. Why the big deal? Many other civilizations either wink out, evolve out, or are overthrown. As you well know, Greece and the Hellenistic time frame were overthrown. We don't really lament that. We don't walk around and say, oh, if Greece had only hadn't fallen. One of the reasons why this is not nearly as big a deal is that many aspects of Greek civilization were later taken over by the Romans and they're passed down. So we're not talking about a loss of civilizations so very much. We talked about Egypt at some length earlier on in this course, and in doing so, I talked about the various kingdoms And eventually, of course, they're overwhelmed. They're conquered by a few people, the Persians and later the Greeks. We don't find scholars walking around saying, oh, the fall of Egypt was so devastating. You see, we have other civilizations. We don't lament nearly as much. But scholars have a tendency to lament the loss of Rome. Part of this actually comes through the Enlightenment. I'm going to argue strongly, if we were taking the modern history course, modern civilization course, I would hit the Enlightenment a lot more heavily than I can here. But the Enlightenment is, can we say, one of the most important intellectual movements that creates the modern world. Many of the aspects of the Enlightenment, reasonable, rational societies, not paying as much attention to religion, representation in government, a more fair way of functioning. These are the kinds of things that come down to us through the Enlightenment. I should mention the importance of education because we are here right now quite obviously involved in education. I'm glad you're doing that. Aspects of the Enlightenment tend to hate the church. By this, I mean the Christian church, or more specifically, the Catholic Church. Some of the more prominent Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire and Immanuel Kant, they hated the church, and they hated the Middle Ages because they thought the church was dominated by the Middle Ages. I said that backwards, didn't I? The Middle Ages was dominated by the church, and the church was superstitious. It believed in revealed religion. It used the Bible for authority, and this is one of the ways that people have not made progress by referring to these, shall we say, unenlightened ideas. The Enlightenment, we follow the Enlightenment in many respects. If the Enlightenment hates the Middle Ages, hates the Catholic Church, and therefore laments the fall of Rome, then maybe we should as well. After the Renaissance, remember the Renaissance is a rebirth, if you will, of ancient learning. In other words, artistic and literary forms, where they follow the ideas of Greece and Rome, primarily Rome. And this was a very important part of higher education. Well into the 19th century, if you were to go to a European university, you'd better know Greek and you better know Latin. In some cases, you were supposed to submit your doctoral work, not only in your native language, whatever that might be, but also in Latin as well. Can we say, therefore, that a lot of the education of the time frame was actually classical in learning? If you and I were in a university at that time frame, each one of us would better know very good Latin, or we're not going to survive. Can we say, as these people look at their admiration for Roman society and Roman civilization, that the loss of that or the change of that would be lamented? Certainly that would be the case. Well, when we start lamenting the fall of Rome, we do have a tendency to see that it shows up in various manners. Now, I'm a Cold War kid. I was raised during the Cold War, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where we talked about how weak America is, and we need to be strong to meet the communist threat. Boy, they shove that down our throat all the time in school and church. We heard a lot about that. And people like to use the analysis, the comparison, if you will, that the Americans of the 20th century, the United States of America, is on the edge of destruction because we are becoming like the Romans. And the Romans fell, therefore we will fall. We are weak. We are lazy. We drive cars to go to school rather than we drive cars to go to school rather than walk. We drive cars to shop rather than using bicycles. I mean, obviously the Russians aren't doing this, therefore they're stronger and we're weaker. There's a lot of aspects to this, but there is a comparison. America is ripe for destruction. I'm going to call this Cold War propaganda. I think the differences between America and ancient Rome are highly significant. And I never did buy the idea that somehow we are weak. Our institutions are weak, our economy is weak, our people are weak. That would lead to destruction. as was supposedly the case with Rome. Let's take a look at some of the reasons why people thought Rome fell. There's a number of theories. There's no real consensus, but let's take a look at a few of these. One of the reasons why I'm bringing this to your attention is that I think it's helped us to analyze how intellectuals think and how they reason. And maybe looking at examples, shall we say, of strong reasoning or weak reasoning, that might help us in our own understanding and our own ability to rationally deal with what's happening in the world. Let's take a look at Edward Gibbon. Edward Gibbon was an Englishman. Can we say he's influenced by the Enlightenment? Yep, we sure can. A look at his years. This is late in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment's been around for a long time. So his ideas tend to reflect some things that we see that are similar in the Enlightenment. His monumental work, multiple, was it 6 volumes? The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. As you can see, it was published, the first volume anyway, was published in 1776. As Americans, that's an easy date to remember because something else happened in Congress or something about that time frame, so it's an easy date for us to remember. I've read this. I read all volumes. I really enjoyed it. This is way back when, decades ago when I was in grad school, but I really enjoyed this. I remember reading each volume. I got a lot out of it. And I looked forward to reading the next volume. And when I was all done, I was a little bit disappointed. This is well worth your time. However, let me just point out something that you might want to be interested in. I read this decades ago, and my memory of it is, shall we say, a lot of vague ideas. But specific information is very hard for me to come by. I would have been much better off had I not got this out of the library. See, the library, you got it, you read it, it's very good, you take it back. If I had my own copies and had my pen with me and pulled that out and get a pen for illustration, here's a pen, get a pen out there and written in the margins or highlighted it, then I would be able to use it much more effectively. What I'm dealing with now is my memory. I have vague impressions, as I've mentioned. Do remember a few specific things. It's usually when Gibbon irritated me. One of the ways he irritated me was to say that if you care about the loss of a poor man's house, in other words, you might compare a monument, a temple, an administrative building that has artistic merit. If you, in fact, are as concerned about the loss of a poor man's house, a hut, then there's something wrong with your beliefs. You should be very much more concerned about the loss of an administrative building or an artistic treasure. Well, he is right in the fact that it's a tragedy to lose these things, but maybe I'm a little bit too egalitarian for that argument, because I say the loss of a poor man's house, the loss of a poor man's community, is at least as devastating as a loss of a monument. Can we say, therefore, he irritated me? That is the case. Well, let's go on and talk a little bit more about his main arguments. It's not like he makes a huge deal about this. And I remember I read through this. There's a few pages. I go, oh, that's kind of interesting. I didn't really sink into my brain until later on. I saw that other scholars had come back and taken a very careful look at one of his overriding theses. And one of his overriding theses as to the decline of the Roman Empire. He discusses numerous issues. He gives you a good narrative of the kind of things that's happening. But he argued this: Christianity saps the manpower. You needed more manpower to face the invasion of the Germanic tribes. His argument was simply this: there are thousands, can we say tens of thousands, of men in the latter part of the Roman Empire that went into monasteries. And when you're involved in being in monasteries, my goodness, what are you doing there? You're not fighting. You worship the Lord, you pray, you sing hymns, you fast. You work in fields. We'll come back and talk about monasticism a little bit later. But according to Gibbon, thousands, tens of thousands of men are taken out of the force. Therefore, let's get a picture of Edward Gibbon up here if I can find him. God have Edward Gibbon. And here we go. Okay, Edward Gibbon. Very important intellectual. Well, Christianity saps manpower. Well, really? Now, I've visited monasteries. There was one when I was living in the East, near where my apartment was. I went over there. And I didn't see guys over there practicing martial arts. Or, quite frankly, I don't think monks make good soldiers. Yeah, I'm sorry. They're just not macho enough. They're not mean enough. And if you take those guys and stick a spear in their hand and say, you will defend the state, are they going to be effective in this? Remember, there's tens of millions of people living in the Roman Empire. To sap up a few thousand or a few tens of thousands that are unavailable for military service, I cannot believe in any real sense that makes any difference. I'm sorry, I really do not think that this can possibly be viewed as a factor. Well, there's something else that Christianity brings to the state, and that is morality. Christian morality, love thy neighbor, forgive thine enemies, all these kinds of things, which we are familiar with as Christians, that weaken the state. We need a state that's powerful. We need a state that's strong. We need people that are willing to do what is necessary to defend the state. He doesn't really say this in his argument, but is he praising the games, praising the slaughters in the arenas of people being killed? There are people that make the argument. Romans do make this argument. In fact, sometimes the Romans say, of all the aspects of their civilization, the one they're proudest of are in fact the games. But when we actually take a look at this, people are saying that, oh, by the way, this helps our nation be strong. Because if we can look on human suffering, if you look on human death, and we have to kill people to defend the empire or expand the empire, then we're much more willing to do so because we fear it less. Interesting argument. For our effectiveness as a military or defense, do we have to become in a situation where we don't care about life and death? I think this is a very, very weak argument. In fact, if anything, I would argue that perhaps many societies, Rome included, would benefit a little bit more if they had a much stronger morality. Maybe you can negotiate with the enemies rather than kill them. I'm speculating at this point, but I cannot believe that this is a terribly good argument. This is not dead, though I'm throwing dispersions on it. This is not a dead argument. Many years ago, I was talking to a man who had a PhD in Roman history, and he taught Roman history courses. We were friends a little bit. We used to talk somewhat. And I don't know how it got brought up in our conversation, but we talked a little bit about the fall of Rome. And without really getting into discussion of the merit of the arguments, he went into this big pitch to me, saying that the reason why Rome fell was Christianity. The argument being, well, it was based on paganism. When you left that aspect of your religion and you went over to Christianity, the fundamental nature of the state changed. In his case, in his belief, it changed to make it weaker. I didn't hold up my end of the conversation very well at all. I was too busy with my mouth falling to the floor going, are we really still arguing this? I'm sure I would, no matter what I said, I would not have convinced him. But this is an idea that's not dead. Something else that Gibbon said, which I think has much more merit, is the empire became too large for its administration. And so it fell apart. Well, transportation is improved when Rome is controlling the seas. Transportation is improved because Rome builds roads and they build bridges. We already talked about this. But does it simply get too large? To a certain extent, we're going back to the idea that Diocletian and later Constantine had to divide the empire so you can more readily react to threats. In other words, ancient Romans, in this case, thought that it was a pretty good idea to have the administration closer to your problems. Well, that's a good point, except for this. Rome actually reaches its size in the 1st century AD. It's only exists for 400 more years. That's a long time to have a mortal sickness. You think that if it got too large for its administration, it in fact would have started to decline and fall much earlier than it did. I think there's something to this, but let's not interpret this too broadly. We have a Frenchman now who came up with a very interesting discussion, and he's Ferdinand Lot. So let's see if I can get a picture of Ferdinand Lot. Ferdinand, how about Ferdinand? And how about if I do it right this time? Ferdinand, get my hands in the right place. In and watch your professor learn how to type. Okay, Ferdinand Lot. Got a picture on him. Let's get a picture on Mr. Ferdinand Lot. Okay, now we've got lots. Lots and lots and lots. How about a portrait? Portrait. And I have no idea what I'm looking at, but I don't see Ferdinand Lot here at all. Let's say he's a Frenchman, and he is. Ferdinand Lot. I got to learn how to give up on these things. If I don't have it, I don't have it. But I'm having it. Is that Ferdinand Lot? Okay. No, it's somebody else. Any event, let's go back and look at Edward Gibbon and give up on Ferdinand Lot. Ferdinand Lot was a historian, French historian. And he wrote a 2-volume history, published a 2-volume history on the end of the ancient world in economic theory. For my PhD program, I had to learn or demonstrate competency into reading French. I passed the examinations, I passed the course, and I decided, well, I read this already in English, let's read this in French. So I went back to the French, and after studying a few pages saying, I'm kind of making sense of this, but I'm not good enough with my French to sit down and read it. I've done a little more work on my French since then. I'm a little bit better. Nonetheless, I have read this, and it's a very good story. He talks about the various problems Rome had, but he comes up with this master thesis. And essentially, the balance of trade makes the West weak. Remember when we were talking about this? Let me get a map on this. Go back and look at the Roman Empire, the division of the Roman Empire. And remember when Diocletian and Constantine, following up on this, essentially divided the Roman Empire into sections. When we talk about the decline of the Roman Empire, whoa, there goes my mouse. The mouse, get away. Let's get the mouse here. Let's hope the mouth is still functioning. I believe it is. Okay, it's not busted up too bad. And I did have a map which I thought worked. Let's try that one. Okay, let's get this chair over here a little bit closer so I won't have that problem again. All right, so we have Ferdinand Lot. He came up with an economic theory. Look at the date in which he had this published. This is 1931. The Great Depression starts in 1929. The stock market collapse in 1929. Other things that happened, the raising of tariffs internationally by 1930 and 31. Can we say the economy is largely in free fall? The world economy is in free fall. We have very major problems as far as this is concerned. Could this influence his thinking? Yes, it could. And I wouldn't be surprised to see an economic theory come out at this time frame. His argument is essentially this. We have the West, let's pull the West over here, and we have the East. Remember, the West is what collapsed. The East has maintained the Byzantine Empire, I've already mentioned this, for almost another 1,000 years. Now, we go over here to the west, this is where it collapsed. And we take a look at places like Gaul, which is France, and we say, well, what is Gaul producing? According to Ferdinand Lot, what the French, the Gauls in this case, this of course includes Spain and other places, they're producing little, but they're consuming much. In other words, they're buying luxury goods, luxury items, I guess art, decorations, pottery, various things of artistic merit, and they're buying it over here. So what is happening here, you have to pay for this. So these people are paying for what they're buying over here. So you have goods going here, but you have money, you have silver. You have coinage going this direction, which has a tendency to get coinage out of circulation. And when you get coinage out of circulation, then the economy becomes weaker. And when the economy became weaker, in fact, this was more vulnerable to external invasions. When the Germans come in, Germanic tribes come in, the West is less able to resist. One of the reasons why I find this interesting is one of the theories on the Great Depression, starting in 1929, was the restriction of the monetary supply. When the Fed, the federal government, decided that there was too much money in circulation and restricted it, and when that took place, there was an economic downturn. That's one of the theories. There are a number of theories, and probably several of which have merit, as to why we have an economic depression starting in 1929. Well, so the idea of restricting or having less money in circulation seems to have merit even by modern economic theory. The difficulty with this is, how do you prove this? How in fact do you prove that there is a strain going on? What is your external evidence? It is a logical argument, but in reality, how can you demonstrate it? Doesn't mean it's wrong. But let's take a look at the manufacturing here versus here. Yeah, it's true. You can probably buy better jewelry over here and sell it in this direction. We do know about manufacturing in Gaul, however. They made armor. So armor could be traded for luxury items here. The Romans brought the vine to France. The vine is grapes. And from grapes, you can eat grapes. But grapes are very important for making wine. During the Middle Ages, one of the reasons why France is so powerful and so rich is that it is a brilliant area for growing wine. During the Middle Ages, drinking water was considered a hardship. And many people drank wine virtually in every meal when they could actually afford it. But France is making armor. I mentioned pottery. You can probably find more decorative pottery over here, but the Gauls are also making pottery there. We have armor production. We have some pottery. Armor can be exported. Pottery probably not. But wine, are they exporting wine? I don't know if we have enough information to actually make a good argument on that. But can we say we do have reasons to believe that economically in the West is not as disadvantaged as Ferdinand Lot would have us believe? I think he's got an insight. It's impossible to prove, and there are reasons, however, to believe that it's, shall we say, a weak argument. Let's go look at a few others here. Take a look at Oswald Spengler. Need a picture of Oswald Spengler. Oh, I need to see it. Either I wear glasses or get binoculars or something. Okay. Oswald Spengler, let's get an image. Here are some photographs of Oswald Spengler. Let's take a look at this guy. Can we say perhaps he was also known as Sourpuss Spengler? If this guy was able to smile, I don't know how he managed it, because the photographs of him, the portraits of him, do not show a happy camper. So, bad idea. So let's look at Oswald Spengler. And However, we have a portrait of a man by the name of Winkler. And I think he's also known as Sourpuss Winkler. This was taken a few years ago down at UVU for my ID card, and I go, well, why smile? Look like I'm having a pretty bad day. So I like to think that I'm not always sour, but maybe Oswald Spengler was. Anyway, let's take a look at his basic ideas. The Decline of the West. Two editions of this, two versions of it. He publishes in 1918 and 1920. Spengler was a German. And as you well know from your understanding of World War I, Germany loses the war. It's a pretty awful thing that happens. They lose the war. The blockade that the British were able to put on Germany caused many people to go hungry, many people to starve. Children were growing up with vitamin deficiencies because they couldn't get enough food. And so anyway, he comes up with these basic ideas. We would think the mentality of this time frame would be relatively negative. And I think this does come across as being somewhat negative. Well, he makes an argument that civilization grow and age like an organism. Like people, like an animal. The idea is, well, when you're young. Remember when you were young, you little boy, little girl? I remember whacking my head against walls all the time, falling down, people calling you stupid. Those kind of things are just part of our growing up. We have to learn how to walk. We have to learn to interact. But then you hit your teenage years and you're still kind of feeling your way along. You get your driver's license, you go out and do a little cruising with the guys and those kind of things. You're trying to find where you fit in society. Then you hit your stride. You're in your 20s. You come to UVU. You get a good education. You get a better job. You begin to look at things differently. You begin to buy art, like I have paintings on the wall. You do things that are artistic. You like to go to the movies and theater. By darn, you're hitting your stride. But then it all falls apart. Relatively slowly, but it does fall apart. You get old. Oh, your back hurts. I don't want to go out and conquer new worlds. I don't want to get a new job. I just want to sit back and relax. I'm not energetic anymore. Then after a while, I physically decline and my mentality changes and I die. I wink out of existence. Are civilizations and societies like this? Can we say early Rome was feeling its way along, got big and powerful, started investing in art and architecture, important in literature. Then after a while, you kind of get tired and don't want to do it anymore. And then you wink out. Well, some of the problems with this is it's a theory that kind of fits virtually every existence. I mean, there's almost no civilization, no society that was always there. There was always a developmental period. And then over time, well, you conquer nearby areas. If you don't do that, they conquer you. And maybe after a while, you do get interested more in art. When you're expanding, a lot of your money goes in the military. This is fairly common development. But how do we define, therefore, when you go into decline? Remember, I've got no memory. I remember back in the 70s. United States, we were a little bit concerned. We'd fight in Vietnam, and we're embarrassed by what happened. We're embarrassed by how we treated the veterans. And some people are not feeling terribly optimistic about themselves. And then in the 1970s, we go into some severe economic decline. We have recessions. And from the perspective of the 70s, rethinking our society, and then we looking about the economic decline, there are people saying it's over. The heyday of the United States was in the 1950s. Oh, we were making good movies, and we got television, and we got this economic advances. Everybody's got an automobile, and all these wonderful things are happening. And look at this: the 60s, too much problems. 70s getting worse. It's over, people. We've shot. We've got nothing to look forward to now but decline. And I'm saying everybody believed that, but I did hear this bantered about this time. Well, our memory is much better than that now. Remember, maybe you're too young, but I remember very well when computers really hit. Oh, they hit like crazy. 1990s, we have real economic growth in the United States of over 2% a year. That's dramatic. A lot of that is fed by computers. We'd be banked by computers. Of course, later on we get cell phones. You know, the computer age technology has done an awful lot to expand the U.S. economy. We're more optimistic about our time frame. Things are going quite well. The economy's better. The Soviet Union collapses. The Cold War is really over. Wow. But wait a minute, what happens with the theory that everything's going to pot in 1970s? You see, it doesn't fit. If this was something was a good theory, then you could actually calculate what's happening. But unfortunately, you cannot. Will the United States eventually get old and die? I don't know. Maybe 500 years from now. Certainly will be different than what it is now. I'm sorry. There's just nothing to support this theory. It's just a theory that you can say about almost anything, because nothing lasts forever, and nothing came into existence, and nothing was just always there. So this actually fits, shall we say, in every category. It has a little merit. I don't pay much attention to it. Let's look at some other things which I think maybe have a little bit more merit. Population decline. Why is that important? Well, population decline means that you might not have enough people to keep the empire going. Well, let's look at the theory. Is the population declining? The simple answer is yes. War. Remember the 3rd century, the civil wars. War is disruptive. It kills people, takes men out of society, puts them in the military. When men are in the military, they don't get married, they don't have families. There's a number of ways with which war cuts back on society, number of people. Less food, well, we'll talk about that more as we go. Soil degradation. A lot of times we have problems with loss of soil fertility. Yeah. Less food, less people, yeah. Heavy taxation? Sure. When you're going to war, you have to tax people. Sometimes taxation can be the point where it's burdensome. If it's burdensome, you get to the point where it actually is hurting the economy. So when you have heavy taxation and people are burdened by this, you tend to have smaller families. Environmental degradation, I've already mentioned this. We have soil exhaustion. You're planting too much wheat on a given acre of ground. Over time, it doesn't produce as much. It's probably the case. Loss of soil fertility, I've always mentioned that. Land is taken from cultivation. When you have fewer people, you actually end up having, rather than draining marshes, that the marshes stay. Sometimes when you have a military, you are barricading streams and keeping traffic from going up and down rivers. That can happen. Deforestation. Well, what are your fuels in this time frame? And forests in Italy can be large. Forests in France are huge. But after a while, you simply cut down trees and cut down trees. It's how you heat your buildings. If you're cutting down them faster, then they're growing back. You can have a problem in that case. That might be a factor. I already went into a pitch about lead poisoning. So could that be a factor? Sure, it could be. Are all these enough to argue there's a population decline? Yeah, taken together, they probably are. Now there's diseases. As you probably know, the United States, I should say the world, has been very, very good in fighting diseases. In fact, we got rid of smallpox in the 1970s. Smallpox no longer exists. But it's a big problem in Rome. We'll talk about that in just 1 minute. Right now, as we speak, the disease that still kills more human beings than any other disease in the world is malaria. We're not exactly sure when malaria was introduced to Rome. It could have been around for a while. But it seemed to be quite devastating, particularly in the 5th century AD. That's the 400s, when Rome is in steep decline. One of the reasons why we know it's a big problem is not just from the records, but cemeteries have been excavated that where people were buried in the 5th century. And in going in these cemeteries, we find a very large number of children that died, and upon examination of the remains, we find out that, get my screen back here, we find out that they died of malaria. We have direct evidence that malaria could have been very severe. It could have been devastating. So there could have been a loss in population. We read of other plagues. The Antonine Plague was around in Rome. Roughly, you see the dates about 165 to 180 AD. That's a long time. Swept through various areas, cities, districts. From our records, we're not exactly sure what it was. It could have been smallpox. Could have been measles. We have some indication that smallpox had been around in ancient Egypt. That doesn't mean it's sweeping through a lot of places in every civilization. However, it could have been introduced, reintroduced, or we could have had just a variant form of it spreading around this time frame. Smallpox is devastating. I've read a number of books on it. I'm sorry, sometimes the books disagree. One book said that if you got this in the 18th century, you had about 10% chance of dying. Other books say you had about a 30% chance of dying. Now, in either case, that can be very devastating. But remember, the 17th and 18th centuries are a long time, well over 1,000 years after Rome, after this time frame. We could say, therefore, that the survivors of these earlier advances of smallpox meant that people like you and me, who have numerous generations behind us, that there's a tendency for the people to have built up more immunity. So if the death rates are somewhat accurate, which I've read for later time frames, maybe in fact it was more devastating and a larger percentage of people died of smallpox at this earlier time. Of course, we're not really sure that it was smallpox because some of the descriptions are measles, and as you probably know, measles is less destructive than is smallpox. Well, there's another plague later on, you can see about a century later. We call it the plague of Cyprian. And once again, it's we don't know exactly what it was. Some of the descriptions would have us believe that smallpox, once again, is a likely candidate. It could have also been typhus. So diseases, malaria, smallpox, typhus, perhaps, maybe measles, are bringing people down. So the population is in decline. The question, of course, is, with population decline, is there still enough manpower to defend Rome? Well, how many people lived in Rome? Oh, boy. We know that there were censuses taken. The most famous is in the New Testament. There went a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And in doing so, there were censuses taken. The challenging part about that is we simply don't know what the final count was. Which book do you want to read? I've seen estimates that in its heyday during the Pax Romana, Rome might have had 100 million people, maybe 60 million people. Somewhere in between. Well, what was it like several centuries later? I would hazard a guess, even if the disasters, even if we take the lowest number, which I'm not sure is necessarily the best, we took maybe 60 million people, and we argue that these other factors that brought down the population, in fact, brought it down to, what, 40 million, 30 million? You say, wow, that's an enormous loss. I don't think it was that bad, but maybe it could have been. Let's just play with these numbers. If you have a society, let's use 40 million because it's an easy number to deal with. Half your population is female. They don't make good soldiers. So we got 20 million men who are males. And of these 20 million men, at any given time, there's men that are too old and too infirm, and there are boys that are too young. Can we say adult males are maybe 10 million? Maybe not all those are physically able. Take out a few hundred, tens of thousands for being monks, you still have millions. Maybe it's 7, 8, 9 million men of military age that are physically capable of serving. Oh my goodness. That's enough manpower. I mean, you'd put a very small percentage of that at arms. And you'd certainly have enough to overwhelm the Germanic tribes. I'll come back and discuss this again when we talk about actually the invasion of Rome by the Germanic tribes. But how big of nations are we talking about? Now, some of the Germanic tribes were very large. I remember I talked about the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths already. Tens of thousands, maybe some of the larger ones, 50,000, 40,000 people. It couldn't be huge, couldn't be multiple millions because you can't move that many people. The Germanic tribes were able to move. Once again, let's just pick out the year number 40,000. And so easy to manipulate. Half of those, of course, are women. 20,000 are women, 20,000 are men. How many of those are adult males physically able to serve? Maybe 10,000. At the most, more likely 8,000 or 9,000. If you take a look at these numbers, and we're talking about quite a good number of Germanic tribes, but even that, they don't add up to huge numbers, maybe 100,000. And they're not always invading the same place at the same time. You would think very strongly that there's adequate manpower, more than adequate manpower to defend the empire. I guess if there is enough manpower, why couldn't you get men to serve? Is there something else at play here? Where you couldn't get men to serve? Too many slaves? Slaves won't fight for you. Slave's bad. A slave is not going to go out and risk his life to defend the chains and abuse. Could be factors involved, could be other social factors. It's hard to say. But you could not get enough. But apparently, if we're talking about decline in manpower, it's not the manpower that is lacking. It's the ability to get men who are motivated into the military. Here's something that we hear about. It's called racist. You see, the racist believes that there is a gene pool, that there are human beings that are just simply superior to others. We call them bigots, among other things. And they believe that there was a pure gene pool, shall we say, a very strong gene pool. The original Latin peoples, they were just stronger and better looking and more intelligent. But Rome's around for a long time, and then you bring in other peoples. I mean, how many people came from Sub-Saharan Africa? I don't know. Probably not huge, but some, sure. Did they intermarry? Yeah, have families, sure. There's also the argument that people came from the East. How many people came from far west India? I don't think so. China, of course, you have the Silk Road, which is very, very long, thousands of miles. Very few people come in that direction. But the argument is that people did come from places like India and China. Over time, this actually saps the gene pool. In other words, you've made a mongrel society and makes people weaker. Now, notice I didn't say about the people in Gaul, the Celts in Britain, we call them Britons, and the Germanic tribes in Germany. You see, one of the reasons why you don't include these in your mongrelization of Roman society is the people making the theories are largely Germans and English and Frenchmen. They don't want to say that the problem with the world is me. I think this is absolutely absurd. These are racist theories lack merit. All human societies have the same potential. All human societies are just as intelligent, just as culturally able. And I cannot believe that somehow too many foreigners coming into Italy made them weak. In fact, it might have made them stronger because you have more people there and more ideas that can help. Well, let's look at some things I think is a little bit stronger. How about political instability? That's a problem. Even back during the Republic, we have big problems. The Senate is disagreeing. We have the generals fighting each other even back then. And of course, you have other problems, particularly after, particularly after the time frame of the civil wars in the 3rd century, when you literally have the Praetorian Guard making and breaking emperors, and you're ruling the empire on the basis of military conquest. Yeah, there's something to that. Political instability is going to sap and weaken the society. And maybe that helps us understand why you get fewer men to serve, or fewer men to serve in defending the borders because they're too busy fighting each other. There is no established line of succession for emperors. Sometimes it goes to men of merit, but very often it goes to men of no merit. Lack of loyalty to Rome. I already talked about the army becoming a garrison force. They're far away from Rome. They don't understand or appreciate the Roman way of life, Roman institutions. Therefore, they're a little less likely to defend it. Why? It doesn't affect me that much. When you start hiring foreign mercenaries, when you can't get enough Romans to actually defend Rome, and you start hiring Germanic tribes to come down and fight for you to defend Rome, they'll fight for you as long as they get paid. But if they don't get paid, then they're a big problem. So lack of appreciation of Rome? Sure. And remember, one of the reasons why there is not this really, shall we say, great nationalism to defend Rome is that if you're in the army, remember who pays your wages. It's not from the Roman state. Your general pays your wages. And when your general pays the wages, you do have a tendency to find much more loyalty to him than to the Roman system. Okay, other ideas. Too much luxury and hanky-panky. Oh, let's see. Get some artwork here. There's some artworks. Let's see if I can find them. Yeah. This is one of my favorites here. This is done by Thomas Cole, American painter in the 19th century. He's talking about the fall of empires. And I have a bad joke about this. I call this Weekend at the Frat House, where you have everybody, mayhem and people running around. I know it's a bad joke. I do have a painting of this, which I have in the kitchen right now. There is a painting, and I'm not going to take too long to look at it, of Roman society. And can we say, I'm trying to see the one that I want. What causes the fall of Rome? I would like to get that a little bit bigger to give you a better idea of what's being portrayed. I'll try this. If it doesn't work, I'll give up. Okay, not too bad. Here's a painting. Remember, people are interested. Why did Rome fall? And notice what we have going on here. Well, revelry, people hanging out, not dressed too well. This guy's holding wine in his cup. A little debauchery, a little bit too much drinking. In other words, now we're having an argument that it is the downfall of Rome is because you have too much luxury, hanky-panky, too much drinking, too much lack of loyalty. One of the arguments that Edward Gibbon said in his book was that Rome became administered by people of lower classes, and they were not as able to do a good job even with their training. Another point by him that relatively irritated me, because I don't believe that is the case. But there is an argument that hanky-panky makes people weak, ill, and insane. The Victorians in the 19th century, a lot of these theories were popular, tended to look upon hanky-panky as something that's really, really bad. Many years ago, I had a discussion with a woman who has a PhD in American history. And I sat in her class, I audited it, about the history of the South. And she said she read letters between a man and his wife. And he was saying, I'm sorry, honey, we've had too much physical fun, and that has caused my hemorrhoids. Okay, so obviously we need to cut back on that kind of activity. There were people, remember when the colonies were being established, Let's look at India in the 18th and 19th century by Britain. And you go to India, and people did to administer India, these Victorians that came from England. They looked around at people that were weak, and they're poor. And the idea was not that they're being exploited by British taxation. It's not that they're being exploited because they can't grow enough food to support themselves. It's because they touch themselves. And this causes insanity and weakness. Now the Victorians look around, they look at prostitutes, and prostitutes don't do very well. Prostitutes do become weak, ill, and insane because they've had too much hanky-panky. And the argument is, well, really, if they're not looking at these women are diseased, they're drug addicts, and their lifestyle is extremely challenging physically, is not their problem. I don't think there's really much merit to this. One of the reasons, we don't really know what was going on. Do we really know that all this fol-de-rol, people drinking too much, chasing each other too much, those kind of things are going on in Rome? We don't know. When I took Roman history class at Utah State University many years ago, it was a good class from S. George Ellsworth, very fine man. He taught a good class. And one of the things he was saying is that he said the Romans were Puritans. Since the ideas that somehow they were debauched is much exaggerated. Yeah, we have some experimentation in theater, which is kind of raunchy. There's some poetry that's kind of raunchy. And he says, but however, just go down to a magazine rack, and this is 1970s, and it's a lot raunchier now than it used to be. Just go down to a modern magazine rack and look around and see the kind of sleaze you can see there. And he's saying compared to us, they were probably much more like Puritans, much more restrained. I think the basic theory is flawed because we don't really know that caused insanity. On the other hand, we don't really know what was going on in society. So in this case, I think this is weak. Let me tell you about something else happening at Utah State. I think this is just sort of a sociology class or something. Some students were working up some kind of questionnaires. What do you think about modern morality? And I remember one of the questions on there was, well, do you think a modern society is as debauched and degraded as ancient Rome? I remember looking at that going, you don't know what you're talking about. Of course, if I were to answer that question, I wouldn't know what I was talking about either. But we do see this argument around. Well, let's follow this up a little bit in other areas. Billy Graham, one of the more well-received TV evangelists, was very, very famous. I remember watching him on TV way back in the day. And of course, he would have very big meetings in stadiums, and he changed a lot of lives, did a lot of good for an awful lot of people. I was impressed with him. I wanted to get a better idea as to what he was saying. So the year this came out, he wrote a book, published in 1965. I'm a teenager at the time, and I decided to read it. And his arguments is World of Flame means that we are on decline. I could put this within contexts of the Cold War arguments which I was making earlier. Any event, he's saying in page 20 of this, the mark of decaying civilization is to become obsessed with sex. Okay. The reason why I'm here is because well, anyway, I got here the same way most people get here. My dad had some interests, right? So I think people have been using this kind of thing for a very lengthy period of time. Is it unique to us? Are we doing more than was done in the past? I don't know. Page 22. Declining civilization is with men becoming more effeminate and women becoming more masculine. Man, I took that to heart. Man, did I take that to heart. You see, I didn't want to become more like women. And I look around, well, what's happening here? I know women wear perfume, so I quit wearing cologne. I knew women wore deodorant, so I quit wearing deodorant. Didn't want to be more like a woman, right? As far as I know, it worked. I quit using cologne, I quit using deodorant, and civilization was saved. I couldn't get a date, but that's beside the point. Let me say this is highly questionable assumptions. We don't know what was going on. Some people say maybe Rome didn't fall. It just evolved into something else. Well, clearly there's an evolution involved. Clearly there's a change in institutions. Clearly there's a change in art. It just evolved into something else. Well, yeah, of course, and that happens. All civilizations are always in the process of evolving into something else. Can we say this? It certainly fell in the political sense. I don't think that's without a doubt. What are historians saying now? And more recently, I do teach medieval classes. We do, in the early medieval class, we do discuss the fall of Rome. And I have a textbook for the students, and the author says, Rome didn't really have any fatal problems. It just simply got unlucky. And this is not the only author that I've read said this. Rome didn't have any fatal problems. It simply got unlucky and lost too many battles. Let's use American history in this analysis. Let's say, well, why did the South lose the Civil War? They're outnumbered, they're outmanned, they're outgunned, they're vastly outproduced. But those aren't factors, you see. Of course, they were very heavily outnumbered. They just got unlucky and lost too many battles. See, this isn't helpful. Why did they lose the battles? Why did you lose Gettysburg? Well, you're outnumbered. You're outmanned. They got better weapons. I'm sorry. There's got to be a reason why you get unlucky. And you can't say, I'm unlucky over and over and over again. There's got to be a reason. Your military is weak. Your manpower is weak. Your weaponry is weak. All these things come into play. Some people say it's not all bad. Fall of Rome freed Western civilization. The argument is this, that Rome fell, as you know, in the West. Let's go back to our little map of West. If I can find it, get past Oswald Spengler. Wow, I'm really off. And we go over here to the division of the empire. Remember, see these places that fall, Italy, Spain, France, part of Germany over here. And at least the Germans were living right there at the time, and Britain as well. You see, Rome is not going in this direction that we see in modern society. We can say that it freed Western society. Rome is not trying to go to a free society. It's still a slave society. It's not working toward human rights. But the West does work to free society. We'll talk about this when we mention the Middle Ages, how society became free. Eventually, largely Enlightenment, we do talk more about human rights and human freedoms. New ideas. Rome is involving ideas, but the progressive ideas are really not there. Social mobility. This is a very, very big factor in modern society. It allows us to get an education. It allows us to improve ourselves. It allows us to make a better society. And one of the rationales for this is because we have social mobility. This is not happening in ancient Rome. The development of science. You and I love science. Science and technology is around us all the time. The light bulbs, the computers, to everything. That is brought to us by the West, not in the East, where it didn't fall. Democracy is developed over here, not in the East. Representative governments here, not where it fell. And the Enlightenment takes place over here, not there. If Rome was working in the right directions, you would see all these developments here where it did not fall. But where it did fall, we do see all these developments. Can we make a very bold statement that not in the short run, but maybe in the long run, the fall of Rome was one of the most fortuitous things that ever happened in civilization? This makes possible the modern Western society, which benefits us all to such a great extent. I'm going to say that that is a real possibility. So why did Rome fall? I'm going to make a pretty bold statement. There is probably some merit to all these except for racism and for the idea that there is a uh, organism that winks out. Maybe I should be also weak in areas where we do not have an awful lot of information. But I do want to argue that the fall of Rome was extremely important. It allows for the creation of the Middle Ages, and the Middle Ages actually eventually evolves into the modern world. Well, okay, let's take a look at the major institution. I've already mentioned this. Let me come back to it. That the church was a major institution that tried to carry on Roman ideas. I've already mentioned this. Let me repeat it. Rome had basic assumptions. The church does bring a few different things to the table. But when the church does so, it does try to buy into so many of the advances of Rome, the Roman administration, the Roman law, Roman transportation, Roman organization. And the church survives the fall of Rome to carry on many of these institutions. So it's very, very important. Well, I'm going to jump across this. I'm probably spending a little bit too much time when talking about the nature of Christianity, and we'll be talking about saints in a little while, people that are called saint. And the idea was I was going to give you an explanation of what is a saint. Well, I don't think that's really necessary. I'm going to skip that, in other words. But I am going to go down and start talking about papal prestige, how the institution of the papacy comes to the fore, and how it tends to carry over into the Middle Ages. But I'm virtually out of time, so I'm not going to continue with that. But I will start with that again, talk about papal prestige in our next lecture. In the meantime, wherever you're at, whenever you're watching this, I hope you're having a great day. Hope the weather has turned better by the time you're watching this, and I wish you the best. And I'll talk to you again next time.